Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now we begin. I never thought a question could haunt me like this. A simple one, a fleeting thought, what if it had been worse? The crash was bad, yes, but not deadly. The paramedics assured me I was lucky. They patched me up, sent me home with a few broken bones and a head full of questions. It wasn't the kind of accident that should have left me feeling uneasy, but it did. I still remember the smell of burnt rubber, the screech of metal grinding against metal, the shudder of the car as it skidded across the wet road. Those sounds haunt me, but it's not just the sounds. It's the feeling that something followed me from that night. I thought it was just fear, just the aftershock of the trauma. But it was. The apartment I returned to was as I had left it. The familiar creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant chatter of neighbors through the thin walls. But it was wrong. I felt the weight of silence press on me, thicker than ever. I shrugged it off. There was no reason to overthink it, right? After all, I was alive. That was something to be thankful for. But then the signs began. At first, they were subtle. Nothing too alarming. The faint scent of something rotting in the air, like a forgotten meal that had turned to mold. It lingered even when I climbed, a smell I couldn't place. It was just there, always there. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind. A draft through the cracked window. But no matter how many times I closed it, they continued. Faint murmurs, too soft to understand, but growing in volume the longer I stayed in the room. I told myself it was nothing. My mind playing tricks. But then it wasn't just whispers. It was sound. Sounds that weren't there before. A step on the staircase, a knock on the door when I was alone. The walls felt alive. And the shadows. They weren't shadows. Not really. They moved differently, stretched too far, twisted in impossible ways. I'd turn my head, and for just a split second, I would swear I saw something dart into a corner. But when I looked, nothing was there. My heart raced as the unease crept up my spine. I told myself it was just the stress of the accident, the after effects of a head injury. But it didn't feel like that. I wasn't alone in this apartment anymore. Something else was here with me. I could feel its presence, something I couldn't explain. I wanted to scream, to demand answers. But I couldn't. I had to convince myself it wasn't real. That I wasn't losing my mind. But I knew deep down I was. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense the signs became. I sat down on the couch, hoping to calm my mind. I just needed a moment of peace. But the moment I closed my eyes, I heard it. The sound of tires screeching on wet pavement. The sound of metal grinding against metal. It was loud, sharper than any memory of the crash itself. I jumped up, heart pounding in my chest. The room felt cold, the shadows darker. My breath quickened. I couldn't escape it. The accident wasn't over. It was still happening, and I was still in it. I tried to push it away. I had to be strong. But every time I closed my eyes, the same sound played in my mind, looping, trapping me in a nightmare that wouldn't let me go. And then for the first time, I saw it. A figure, at the edge of my vision, barely noticeable. A dark silhouette, tall and looming. I could feel it watching me, waiting. I turned quickly, hoping it was just my imagination. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. I tried to calm myself. This wasn't real. But what if it was? What if the crash had brought something back with me? My mind raced, torn between rationality and fear. The question kept repeating in my head, what if it had been worse? I stood frozen in place, the figure in the corner of my eye lingering. I could feel the darkness pressing in, and it wasn't just the room. It was everywhere, creeping into the cracks of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the sounds or the shadows anymore. It was the silence, the kind that suffocates, that makes you question the space around you. I'd never felt this way before, not even after the accident itself. The thud of my heart was louder than my thoughts, louder than the whispers that had become my constant companions. I tried to focus. The apartment was as it always was. Dim light filtering through the blinds, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the old wood underfoot. But now everything felt wrong. The air itself felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. Each breath seemed more labored than the last, as if the walls were closing in. I looked around, almost expecting to see something waiting in the shadows. But there was nothing. Nothing except that damn smell, sickly sweet, like something decaying, but not quite. It clung to everything, my clothes, my skin, the very fabric of the apartment. I tried to ignore it, but it stuck to me like a stain I couldn't wash off. My gaze drifted to the window. The streets outside were quiet, far too quiet. The usual sounds of traffic and voices seemed muffled, like they were miles away. The night was still, as if the world outside had stopped moving altogether. It was unnerving. I couldn't just sit here anymore. I needed to do something, anything to distract myself from the rising panic in my chest. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. Maybe a walk would clear my head. Maybe getting out of this apartment would make everything feel normal again. The cool night air hit me like a shock, a welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. I took a deep breath, the air fresh but tinged with the scent of something metallic, something wrong. But I pushed it down. I was imagining things. It was just the accident. I had to let it go. I walked down the street, the familiar sounds of my footsteps on the pavement grounding me. The streetlights flickered as I passed, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched across the sidewalk. The city was asleep, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I kept moving, telling myself it was nothing. But the more I walked, the more I felt like something was following me, just out of sight. I turned a corner and froze. The car, parked along the curb, its headlights dimmed but not off. The engine was running, the faint sound of its idle hum cutting through the silence. The car looked familiar. Too familiar. I couldn't remember ever seeing it before, but the feeling in my gut told me I had. A dark sedan, the kind you'd forget as soon as you saw it. But now I couldn't look away. The headlights seemed to flicker, like they were trying to catch my attention. I moved closer, my footsteps hesitant, but my curiosity pulled me forward. As I reached the car, I noticed the passenger side window was cracked open just slightly, enough for a chill breeze to slip through. A small, almost imperceptible sound came from inside, like a whisper too faint to make out. I leaned closer, trying to hear better, but the sound stopped. For a moment, everything was still again. And then I heard it, my name. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest, but no one was there. Just the empty street, the darkened buildings, the stillness that felt unnatural. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scanned the area, looking for the source of that voice, that whisper. But there was no one. Just me alone with the car and the strange feeling that something had just brushed against my mind. I turned back to the sedan. The window was now wide open, as if inviting me in. I hesitated, the fear tightening in my chest, but some invisible pull urged me forward. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling as I gripped it. The car seemed to sigh as the door swung open, the creak of metal too loud in the silence. Inside, the seat was empty. But the air was thick, the smell of something sharp, almost chemical, stinging my nose. I stepped back, my pulse pounding. There was no one in the car. No driver, no passengers. Just the lingering presence of something I couldn't name. The whisper returned, louder this time. It wasn't my name this time, though. It was a phrase. It's not over. I recoiled, the words reverberating in my skull. I stumbled back, nearly falling to the ground as the fear washed over me in waves. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The words kept echoing in my mind, drowning out everything else. I had to get out of here. I turned and fled down the street, not looking back. But even as I ran, I could feel the eyes on me, following me. And the whispers, they hadn't stopped. They were getting louder, closer. I could feel them in my bones, crawling beneath my skin. I wasn't alone anymore. Not in this city. Not in this world. I didn't know what was happening to me. All I knew was that the crash hadn't been the end. It had only been the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers and the shadows had followed me back to my apartment, a constant presence that I couldn't shake. I kept my lights on, every single one of them, as though I could outrun whatever was lurking in the dark corners of my mind. But it didn't help. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, even in the light. I couldn't escape them. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart jump. Every gust of wind outside sounded like a voice calling my name. I couldn't stop myself from looking over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced that something was just behind me, watching. I couldn't bear to close my eyes. I couldn't bear to sleep because every time I did, I was back in the car, hearing that sickening screech of metal, the crash, the pain. And the voice. It hadn't stopped. That phrase, "it's not over," it echoed in my mind, louder with each passing minute, turning into a chant I couldn't escape. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was real. I could feel the weight of something watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, PTSD from the accident, some twisted manifestation of my fear. But I wasn't so sure anymore. The next morning I woke to a dark sky, the kind that doesn't promise rain but brings it anyway. The air was thick with moisture and the clouds hung low, like a weight pressing down on the world. As I stepped outside, I noticed the same dark sedan from the night before parked across the street. I froze. It was there. I couldn't deny it now. It had to be the same car, the same eerie presence. The way the headlights had flickered, the whisper that had called my name. It was all too familiar, too disturbing. I thought about turning back, about running away, but I couldn't. I had to know what was happening to me. I crossed the street slowly, my body tense, every instinct screaming at me to run. As I got closer, I noticed something else. The car wasn't empty. There was someone sitting in the driver's seat. I couldn't make out their face, the figure obscured by the dark tint of the windows. But I felt them watching me, felt the weight of their gaze like a tangible thing pressing against my chest. My heart skipped a beat as I approached the car, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. The window rolled down slowly, as if someone on the other side was in no hurry. I leaned down, bracing myself for whatever lay beyond that dark glass. My breath caught in my throat when the window finally revealed the driver's face, or rather, the absence of it. There was no face, no features, just a smooth, featureless void where a person's face should have been. It was like looking into the abyss, and the abyss was staring back at me. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. I was frozen in place, unable to look away from the empty face. It felt like the air itself was growing thicker, the oppressive weight of the presence suffocating me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The voice came again, clearer this time. Not a whisper anymore, but a full sentence, as if it was coming from inside my own mind, but not my own thoughts. You're still here. I stumbled backward, my hand instinctively reaching for the ground as I tried to steady myself. The world spun around me, my head a dizzying blur. I could feel something pulling at me, tugging me toward the car, toward the empty face that wasn't really a face. I forced myself to turn away. I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. But as I turned and began to walk quickly away, I felt something brush against my arm. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and it sent a jolt of terror through me. I glanced over my shoulder, but the car was gone. The street was empty, like it had never been there. The weight in the air lifted just a little, but the dread in my chest remained, a gnawing, insistent feeling that something was coming. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know how to make sense of what was happening to me. But I knew one thing for sure now, I wasn't just imagining it. Whatever had followed me from that crash, it was real. And it was getting closer. I rushed back to my apartment, my mind racing, my body trembling. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, though I knew it wouldn't help. Nothing would help. The presence had already settled in. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't describe. And then, as if to confirm my worst fear, the whispers returned. They were louder now, more distinct. The words were just out of reach, but I could feel them crawling inside my skull, scratching at my thoughts. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my eyes scanning the room, desperate for some explanation, some way to make sense of it all. And that's when I saw it. A symbol scrawled hastily on the wall in dark, smeared paint. It was the same shape as the one I had seen on the car, the symbol from my dream, the one I had tried so hard to forget. The symbol that meant death. The whispers grew louder, the air grew colder, and the room seemed to warp around me, the walls closing in. I was no longer alone. Whatever was here with me wasn't just watching anymore. It was ready. The symbol on the wall pulsed, its dark, smeared paint almost alive, twisting as if it were beckoning me closer. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. The room seemed to tilt around me, the shadows deepening, stretching, until they swallowed the corners of my vision. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, each breath more strained than the one before. I took a step back, but the feeling of being trapped, of being drawn toward the symbol, kept me rooted in place. My mind screamed for me to leave, to run, but my feet didn't move. I could hear it again, the whispers. They weren't just murmurs anymore. They were voices speaking in unison, soft but clear. They didn't speak in words I could understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't a warning, it was a command. "Come closer," they whispered. It wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. It was real. I knew it in the pit of my stomach. My legs trembled as I took a step forward, drawn to the wall as if something invisible were pulling me. I tried to fight it. I tried to turn away, but my body betrayed me. Every movement felt like it wasn't my own. When my hand touched the wall, the symbol shuddered beneath my fingers. The paint seemed to pulse beneath my touch, like it was breathing. And then everything went black. I gasped for air, but there was no air. I was drowning in darkness. My heart was racing, thumping so loudly in my ears that it drowned out every other sound. I couldn't feel the ground beneath me, couldn't hear anything except my own rapid breathing. I was falling, or was I floating? I opened my eyes, and everything around me was unfamiliar. The room was gone. The walls, the apartment, the city, everything had vanished. I was standing in a place that felt wrong, a place that was neither light nor dark, but somewhere in between, like a dream where the rules of the world didn't apply. The air was thick with something I couldn't describe, something heavy, like the weight of 1,000 secrets, pressing in on me from all sides. I could see shapes in the darkness, just out of reach of the dim light. Shadows stretching and twitching, moving like they were alive, like they were watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. And then I saw it. A figure emerging from the shadows, tall and thin. It was draped in a cloak of darkness, its features obscured by the same shadowy veil that hung over the room. The air seemed to ripple around it, bending and warping in unnatural ways, as though reality itself was afraid to touch it. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. "You shouldn't have come," the voice came, deep and cold, echoing in the empty space. It wasn't the whispering voices anymore. This voice was clearer, more defined, and it sent chills down my spine. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, a force, speaking directly into my mind. I couldn't speak. I couldn't respond. All I could do was stand there, frozen in terror, as the figure moved closer, its long, shadowy form gliding through the air like smoke. It's too late for you. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. I was trapped, surrounded by this thing, this creature. Its presence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. And I could feel it in my chest, like something was clawing its way through my ribs, trying to tear me apart from the inside out. I gasped for breath, but the air was thick, heavy, like I was suffocating. My vision blurred, the shadows around me swirling, becoming more defined. I could see faces in the dark, eyes staring out from the blackness. They were all watching me, waiting. And then I realized these weren't just faces. They were reflections of me. Faces from the crash. Faces of people who had been there, people I had hurt. The faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes pleading with me. But they weren't looking at me with hatred. They were looking at me with fear. And then it hit me, the realization crashed over me like a wave. I had caused this. I was the reason they were here, the reason this nightmare was happening. The accident, the crash, the pain, I hadn't just survived it. I had brought something back with me. I had brought them back. You cannot escape, the voice echoed again, louder now, the sound vibrating through my bones. It's your turn now. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, my body betraying me. The figure was getting closer, its form becoming more solid, more real. It reached out its hand, no, not a hand, but a shape, a mass of darkness, hovered just above my shoulder. It's your turn, it repeated, and this time I felt it. I felt the weight of those words, the inevitability in them. And then the darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up gasping for air, my body slick with sweat. I was back in my apartment, lying on the floor in front of the wall with the symbol. My hand was still pressed against it, the paint cold and damp beneath my fingers. My heart was pounding, but the room was silent. The shadows had retreated, and for a moment I thought it had all been a dream. But the symbol on the wall was still there. It hadn't changed. It hadn't gone away. And then I heard it again. The whisper now louder than ever. Not in my mind, but in the room, as clear as day. It's not over. I jumped to my feet, my mind racing, the panic rising in my chest again. The walls felt like they were closing in. I could feel the weight of the presence just beyond my reach, waiting for the moment to strike. I didn't know how much longer I could take this. The terror, the whispers, the shadows, it was all becoming too much. And the worst part, I knew it wouldn't stop. It couldn't. It had already begun. The whispers didn't stop. They were louder now, more insistent, filling every corner of my mind, rattling my thoughts until they were nothing more than broken fragments of fear. I could feel their presence, as though it were a weight on my chest, pressing down with each breath I took. It was as though the entire world had tilted off its axis, leaving me suspended in a place where nothing was real, and yet everything was suffocatingly real at the same time. I tried to ignore the symbol on the wall. I tried to focus on something else, anything else, but the darkness was all-encompassing, swallowing every thought, every moment of clarity. It was relentless. It followed me, crawled inside me, and I couldn't escape. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I tried to distance myself from the crash, from the voices, from the shadows, it all circled back. The thing in the car, the figure in the darkness, the faces. It was all tied together. And I was at the center of it. I stumbled to my feet, my body trembling with the exhaustion of fear and confusion. The room felt alive with tension. The walls were closing in again, and the familiar creaks of the apartment seemed more ominous than before. Each sound, every small movement, amplified in my ears. The air felt heavier than it had earlier, as if it were thickening around me, thick with the weight of something unspeakable, something ancient. And still the whispers pressed on. There was no escape from them. "You can't run from the past," the voice said again, clearer this time, as though the figure was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. I could almost feel the cold touch of its fingers on my skin. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was a command, a decree. And for the first time I understood. I had no choice but to face it. Whatever it was, whatever I had brought back with me, it would never let me go until I confronted it. I stood frozen, my mind racing. I wanted to scream, to cry out, to demand answers. But I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. My mouth was dry and my chest ached with the weight of it all. The room, the walls, the air, everything felt like it was closing in, suffocating me, and yet I knew deep down that it wasn't the room itself that was trapping me. It was me. I had to make a choice. For the first time since the accident, I wasn't sure if I had truly survived it. I'd thought I was free, thought that if I just walked away, it would all be behind me. But it was. It had never been that simple. The crash had opened a door, and whatever had followed me from the other side wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was here. But why? Why me? Why now? My mind spun with all the possible explanations, guilt, trauma, delusion, but none of them made sense. The voices were too real. The presence too tangible. The symbol on the wall. It had been painted with something dark, something that reached into my very soul. It had connected me to something I couldn't see, something I couldn't understand. A chill swept through me, and I turned toward the window. Outside, the city was silent. The streets were empty, bathed in the cold, unforgiving light of the street lamps. But something was wrong. The air outside felt wrong, too. It was too quiet, too still, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. I walked toward the window, every step slow, hesitant. My reflection in the glass seemed distant, like it wasn't mine. The face staring back at me was pale, hollow-eyed. It didn't look like me. Not anymore. I wanted to step away, to pull myself back from this nightmare, but the whispers wouldn't let me. They were inside me now, deep in my bones, a constant murmur, a warning I couldn't shake. "You have to make a choice," the voice whispered again. It wasn't just a question, it was an ultimatum. I could feel the weight of it in my chest. The terror of what might happen if I didn't. I turned away from the window and walked back to the wall with the symbol. The paint still gleamed in the dim light, dark and oily, like it was alive. The faces, the eyes, they were there, watching, waiting. I could feel them behind me, could feel their presence like a weight pressing down on my back. I had to make a choice. I closed my eyes, trying to focus, trying to clear the panic from my mind. And for the first time, I understood. The truth was right there, just out of reach, but it was there. The car, the crash, the thing in the car. It had all led to this. I had brought something back with me. The symbol. It wasn't just a warning. It was a key. It was how I could stop it, how I could end it. But there was a price. I didn't know what the price was, but I knew deep down that I would have to pay it. I reached for the symbol, my fingers trembling as they touched the dark paint. For a moment, nothing happened. The air around me felt thick, like everything was holding its breath. Then, as if the room itself exhaled, the darkness seemed to shift. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched and warped, and I felt a coldness seep through me, like it was reaching inside. It's too late, the voice said, but this time it wasn't just in my head. It was behind me, close enough that I could feel its breath on my neck. I turned around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, except for the car. It was back, sitting in the middle of the room, a dark silhouette against the dim light. The headlights flickered. The engine hummed softly, as if it had never left. And in the driver's seat, the figure was waiting. The choice had been made. There was no turning back. I stepped forward toward the car, and I knew that whatever happened next, I would face it. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like, but if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Why would anyone drown in a place like this? I didn't expect it to be the first question that crossed my mind when I first saw the body floating in the still water of the reservoir. A man in his 30s, face pale and lifeless, his limbs splayed like a puppet whose strings had been severed. The water, which had been so calm only moments before, now seemed to ripple with an unspoken tension. I had never seen death up close. Not like this. Not like the way the water seemed to swallow the man, as if it were holding him in place, a final, terrible embrace. I wasn't a detective, just an ordinary reporter with a curiosity that often led me down the wrong paths. But today, curiosity had led me to something much darker than I could have ever imagined. I didn't know the man. I didn't even know his name, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked, the way his body floated in the murky depths of the water, as though he had been placed there. The reservoir was far from the usual tourist spot. People didn't come here for fun or recreation. It was quiet, isolated, surrounded by thick woods that made it feel like it was hiding from the world. I had driven by it countless times without a second thought, but now, in this moment, it seemed to hold an eerie sense of secrecy. I looked around, feeling a growing sense of unease. No one was here except for me and the body. The trees were still, their dark shadows stretching across the water like fingers reaching for something they couldn't grasp. I should have turned around. I should have driven away before I saw the body, before my curiosity pushed me forward. But instead, I found myself stepping closer to the water, my eyes never leaving the lifeless figure that seemed to stare back at me, even in death. It didn't make sense. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of violence. Just the body floating calmly in the water, almost as if he had chosen to drown himself. But I didn't believe that. Not for a second. There was something wrong here, something that didn't fit. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees broke the silence, and I jumped, startled. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned, but no one was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed to grow taller, the shadows longer, as if the whole place had become alive, surrounding me, pressing in on me. I quickly scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone, no one but me and the body. The water didn't help either. It looked wrong, too still, too perfect, almost as though it were waiting for something. But what? I took a step closer, my feet crunching on the dry leaves beneath me. The closer I got, the colder the air seemed to become. The silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the occasional rustle of the leaves or the soft splash of water as the body drifted ever so slightly. I couldn't explain why I felt the need to reach out, to touch the water. Maybe it was the proximity to death. Maybe it was the fear that I couldn't turn back now. But as soon as my fingers skimmed the surface, a shiver ran through me, the coldness sharper than anything I had ever felt. And that's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, but there. A distant whisper that seemed to come from the water itself, swirling in the depths. The hairs on my neck stood up as I pulled my hand back, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper sounded like a voice, though I couldn't make out the words. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to, but I knew deep down that something had happened here, something that wasn't just an accident. There was a story in this water, and I was determined to find it. But what if I wasn't meant to? I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had claimed the man in the reservoir was far from over. Something had awoken here, and it wasn't ready to be buried. The thought of leaving crept into my mind, but I knew better. I couldn't leave. I had already crossed the line. I turned around, my mind racing. What should I do next? Should I call the authorities? Should I tell someone what I'd seen? But before I could make a decision, the whisper came again, louder this time. Elaine. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The voice was unmistakable, clear and chilling. It was coming from the water, from the depths. It wasn't a natural sound, it was a command. I didn't move. I couldn't. I had to know. But the question still lingered in my mind. Why would anyone drown in a place like this? I should have listened. I should have turned around and walked away, but something in the pit of my stomach urged me to stay. The voice, the whisper, hadn't sounded like it was meant for me, yet somehow it felt personal, like a warning or a plea, echoing through the thick air around me. I stood frozen, staring at the water, my heart racing. There was no one around. No one to confirm what I had heard. The only thing that existed now was the sound of my own breath and the murmur of the trees in the wind. Leave. The command reverberated in my mind, pushing against my thoughts, trying to force me into submission. I felt the weight of it, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. I glanced back at the body in the water. It hadn't moved, still as death, as though it had been there for hours. But something about the way the body floated unnerved me. It wasn't right. Water doesn't hold bodies like that, not without resistance. No matter how calm the surface was, a body would have drifted or shifted by now. It was almost as if the water was keeping it in place. I took a hesitant step forward, my feet crunching on the dry leaves again. The voice leave pressed at the back of my mind, but the pull of the mystery was stronger. I had to understand. Had to know why this man was here, why he had died. I knelt by the edge of the water, my eyes fixed on the body. The further I lined in, the stronger the scent of the water became. It wasn't fresh. It didn't smell like clean reservoir water. It had a strange, earthy odor, like rotting leaves mixed with something far worse. It reminded me of something I had smelled before, but I couldn't place it. A few more inches, and my hand hovered just above the surface. The faintest ripple of movement caught my eye, and for a brief moment I could have sworn the man's body shifted. I froze. My pulse quickened. Did he move? Or was it just the current? But the water had been still, almost unnaturally so, since I had arrived. I hesitated. My gut screamed at me to step back, to leave it alone, but curiosity won out again. I couldn't just walk away, not with so many questions unanswered. What had happened here? Was it an accident, a drowning gone wrong, or was there something more? I had to find out. As I leaned closer, something caught my eye, just below the surface of the water. A glint of something metallic. I squinted, trying to make it out. It wasn't a reflection, it was a solid shape, almost imperceptible, like something buried just beneath the surface. I reached out, fingertips brushing the water, and in that moment the temperature seemed to drop. The air around me turned heavy, like a storm was rolling in, but there were no clouds. No sign of rain. Only that strange pressure. I carefully slid my hand into the water, feeling the coolness spread through my fingers. My skin crawled as the ripples spread outward. As I touched the object, my hand brushed against something hard, something solid. I yanked my hand back, startled, my heart pounding. Something was down there. Something I hadn't expected. I forced myself to take another breath and plunged my hand beneath the surface, groping around. My fingers brushed against something cold, something smooth. Slowly I pulled it out, and for a moment I just stared at it, confused. It was a small, rusted key. Not like the ones used for locks or doors, but more like a tool, long and slender with intricate, almost archaic designs etched into the metal. Why would this be here? In the water. And why was it buried just beneath the surface, partially hidden like it had been placed there deliberately? I turned the key over in my hand, but before I could inspect it further, I heard something. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a soft scraping sound like something moving across the ground. My head snapped up, my gaze darting around the reservoir. The trees were still, their dark silhouettes stretching across the water, but there was no wind. No movement. It wasn't natural. Then the sound came again, closer now. Louder. The scraping as if something or someone was dragging itself through the dirt. I stood up abruptly, my heart racing, my mind already spiraling. My eyes scanned the perimeter of the reservoir, but I saw nothing. The trees, the brush, they were empty. But the sound persisted. It was real. It was happening. I took a step back, my hands shaking as I gripped the key tighter. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, low to the ground, moving slowly through the underbrush, weaving in and out of the trees as if it were deliberately trying to stay hidden. I froze, unable to move. The shadow was too far for me to make out any details, but it was there, unmistakable. And it was coming closer. I didn't know what to do. Should I call for help? Should I run? But what if it wasn't a person? What if there was something else in these woods? I couldn't stay. I couldn't let myself be seen. My instincts kicked in, and before I could think, I turned and ran. I ran without looking back, my breath coming in sharp gasps, the sound of my feet pounding against the dirt mixing with the distant scrape that still echoed in the air behind me. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, slamming the door shut, locking it behind me. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white with the force. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. The shadow, the scraping, the key, none of it made sense. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had claimed the man in the reservoir wasn't finished yet. Whatever had been hiding in those woods had been waiting for me. The key sat heavy in my pocket, a constant reminder of the bizarre encounter by the reservoir. My mind raced, the events replaying over and over, each second more puzzling than the last. I had no answers, just fragments. The body in the water, the glint of the key, the shadow in the trees, the strange scraping noise that had driven me into the safety of my car. I couldn't let it go. I shouldn't have returned to that place, not after everything that had happened. But I found myself driving back, as though the pull of the reservoir of the mystery had latched onto me and wouldn't let go. The key had changed something in me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like a piece of the puzzle. I had to understand. As I neared the reservoir, the familiar scent of wet earth and pine trees filled the air. The road was deserted, as it always was, the only sound the hum of my car tires on the asphalt. The sky was overcast, a heavy blanket of clouds that seemed to press down on the landscape, lending the entire area an eerie, suffocating feel. I parked near the edge of the water, just out of sight of the main trail. The reservoir stretched before me, its still surface broken only by the occasional ripple. It seemed different now, more ominous. I couldn't explain why, but everything about it felt wrong. I stepped out of the car, my legs unsteady as I made my way to the water's edge. My heart hammered in my chest, a rhythm that matched the rush of adrenaline coursing through me. I knew I was doing something dangerous, something I shouldn't, but I couldn't stop myself. The key in my pocket pressed against my skin, as if urging me forward. I crouched at the water's edge, my eyes scanning the surface for any sign of the body. But there was nothing. The water looked calm, peaceful even. Almost too peaceful. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, there had been a lifeless man floating in it. The key seemed to call to me, and without thinking, I pulled it from my pocket and held it up to the light. The rusted metal gleamed dully, and the intricate design on its surface seemed to shift in the dim light. It wasn't just an old key. There was something about it, something ancient, something that didn't belong. My mind spun with possibilities. Had someone used this key to lock away a secret? What if the man in the water hadn't drowned at all, but had been placed there, his death part of something far more sinister? Suddenly I heard a noise, a crack of a twig behind me. I froze, my hand clutching the key tighter, my breath catching in my throat. I spun around, expecting to see the shadow from earlier, but there was no one. The woods stood silent, empty, their dark outlines stretching toward me, concealing whatever lay beyond. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, but no further sounds came. The wind stirred the leaves, sending a shiver down my spine. My nerves were frayed, the tension unbearable. Was I just imagining things? Or was someone out there watching me? I stood, feeling the weight of the silence press down on me, and took a few steps back toward the car. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, half expecting someone or something to step out from the trees. But again, there was nothing. Just the quiet expanse of the water, the trees, and the sky above. Then I heard it again. A scraping sound, faint at first but growing louder, unmistakable. It was close now, too close. The sound wasn't coming from the trees this time. It was coming from the water. I froze. My gaze shot to the reservoir, but the surface was as calm as ever. I stood there barely breathing, my pulse thrumming in my ears. Then, with a sickening lurch, something surfaced. It wasn't the body. The water parted slowly, almost lazily, as though something or someone was rising from the depths. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or the wind causing the ripples. But as it rose higher, I realized it wasn't a natural movement. The water was pushing against it, forcing it to the surface. A hand broke through the water, its fingers long and pale, its skin slick with the murky water. Slowly, almost deliberately, the arm emerged fully, reaching out of the reservoir like a drowned corpse trying to pull itself free. I gasped, stumbling backward, my heart racing. The key dropped from my hand and sank into the water, disappearing into the murk. I didn't even notice it. My mind was fixated on the figure emerging from the water. It was the man, the body from earlier. He was alive. His eyes were wide open, staring at me with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. His face was pale, streaked with grime, but there was no mistaking the recognition in his eyes. He wasn't dead. He was alive, and he was looking directly at me. Well, he didn't speak. He didn't make a sound. But he reached for me, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, as though pulling himself out of the water. His fingers twitched, scraping against the rocks as he struggled to climb up the muddy bank, his body trembling with effort. I took a step back, my body paralyzed with fear. How was this possible? What was happening? I had seen him dead, floating lifeless in the water. And now he was alive, crawling toward me. I turned and ran. My legs moved on instinct, carrying me back to the car, back to the safety of the road. The sound of my footsteps echoed in my ears, but it was drowned out by the whisper in the back of my mind, the voice that had warned me to leave. But now it wasn't just a warning. It was a cry for help. Leave. You don't belong here. I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. And yet, as I reached my car and slammed the door shut behind me, I knew that I couldn't escape the truth. Whatever had happened here, whatever was happening, it was far from over. and I was caught in the middle of it. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. My breath came in ragged gasps, the fear still clawing at my chest, refusing to let go. The figure from the water, the man, he was alive, and I had no idea what that meant. I had seen him dead. I had seen his body floating in the reservoir, his life snuffed out in a way that felt unnatural. But now he was crawling out of the water, reaching for me as if nothing had happened. What had I seen? What had I just witnessed? I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, but the trees behind me were empty. The road was empty. Nothing. The weight in the air didn't lift, though. It hung there thick and suffocating, a constant reminder that something wasn't right. I wanted to leave. I wanted to drive as far away from this place as I could. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't be enough. I couldn't run from this. The events had already started spiraling out of control. There was no turning back. Not now. The man in the water wasn't just some random death. He wasn't some tragic accident or a drowning gone wrong. Something bigger was happening, and I had been pulled into it. I reached for the door handle, the cold metal pressing against my palm. I had to go back. I had to see him again. I had to understand what was happening before I lost my mind completely. The drive back to the reservoir felt like a lifetime. The road stretched out before me, the trees now dark and looming, casting long shadows across the asphalt. The sky overhead had turned a sickly gray, the clouds thickening as if they, too, were holding their breath. When I reached the water's edge again, the reservoir looked unchanged. The same stillness, the same eerie silence. But I could feel it in the air, the tension. The unsettling feeling that something wasn't just wrong with the place, it was wrong with everything around it. I parked a little farther away from the water this time. I wasn't sure if I was trying to distance myself from the man who had risen from its depths, or if I was just being cautious. Maybe both. I took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. My feet felt heavy as I walked toward the edge of the water, each step filled with doubt. Would I find him there again? Or had he vanished, returned to whatever dark place he had come from? I reached the spot where I had seen him crawling, where the water had parted to reveal his pale, lifeless form. The ground was wet, still damp from the earlier disturbance, but there was no sign of him. No trace. No blood, no footprints, nothing. I couldn't help but feel the tiniest flicker of relief. But it was quickly replaced with dread. The absence of the man didn't mean the danger had passed. It meant that whatever was happening here was far from over. I looked down at my hands, still shaking. The key. I had dropped it into the water earlier, but I couldn't remember if it had ever surfaced. I walked along the bank, scanning the water, trying to spot any sign of it. My eyes flicked over every ripple, every small disturbance, but there was nothing. The water was eerily calm, as though it had swallowed up all my answers along with the key. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only thing that broke the silence. But even that was unsettling now. The wind felt different. It was colder, stronger, like it was pushing against me, urging me to leave, to forget this place. And yet I couldn't. I couldn't forget. A sudden noise caught my attention. A distant crack. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something in the trees. I turned my head quickly, but I saw nothing. No one. The woods were empty. But then I heard it again. A low creaking sound, almost like a door being opened. I tensed, scanning the trees, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Slowly, cautiously, I took a step back, my feet crunching the leaves beneath me. The sound grew louder, and then without warning, a figure stepped into view. It wasn't the man from the water, but it might as well have been. It was another person, another body, but this one was different. Its face was twisted in pain, its eyes wide and unblinking, like it had been staring into something far worse than death itself. My breath hitched as the figure moved slowly toward me, its body jerking with unnatural stiffness. It wasn't walking, not like a normal person. It was stumbling, dragging its limbs behind it as if they didn't quite belong to it. The air around it shimmered, vibrating with some kind of energy that I couldn't understand. I should have run. I should have turned and fled, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, my body frozen in terror. I couldn't look away from the thing that was dragging itself toward me, the horrible scrape of its feet against the ground filling the air with an unsettling rhythm. It stopped just a few feet away from me, its gaze locked onto mine. Those eyes were hollow, empty, like they had seen too much. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but the words wouldn't come. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a rasp, it spoke. "It's not over." The words sent a cold shiver down my spine, and I finally found my legs, my body finally reacting to the terror that had paralyzed me. I spun on my heel and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I stumbled back to the car, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The sound of my breath, the beat of my pulse, the scrape of footsteps following me, they all blurred together. I didn't stop until I was behind the wheel, the door slammed shut, the engine roaring to life. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know what I had seen. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening in the reservoir, it wasn't done with me yet. I couldn't escape the image of those eyes, the hollow, empty gaze of the figure that had risen from the woods. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly I thought my fingers might snap. The world outside my car was a blur of darkness, but it didn't matter. It felt like everything had changed, like I had crossed some kind of line that couldn't be uncrossed. The road felt endless as I drove, the engines hummed the only sound in the suffocating silence. The reservoir, its dark, stagnant water, loomed in my mind, its presence undeniable, like something that refused to let go. I tried to push it away, to forget everything I'd seen, but the more I tried to block it out, the more vivid it became. The voice, the scraping, the things I had witnessed. I couldn't go back there. I shouldn't go back. And yet something deep inside told me I had no choice. Whatever was happening, whatever was buried in the depths of that water, it had become a part of me. And I couldn't run from it anymore. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the reservoir, my eyes still darting nervously to the rearview mirror. But I knew it was useless. I knew the truth. I couldn't outrun this. The silence in the car was broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind outside, but it wasn't enough to drown out the terror clawing at my mind. I had to go back. I had to face whatever was down there. The man, the shadow, the voice, it was all tied together, and if I didn't understand what was happening, it would consume me. I turned the car around. By the time I arrived back at the reservoir, the sun had set, casting the world in shadows. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches reaching out like twisted hands. I parked in the same spot, just out of sight of the water. Everything about this place felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. But I wasn't going to back down now. I couldn't. I stepped out of the car, the ground beneath my feet wet and soft. The faint scent of decay hung in the air, mixing with the musty scent of damp earth. It reminded me of something I couldn't place, something I had smelled long ago, a memory I couldn't quite reach. The reservoir was still, unnervingly so. The water reflected the sky above, a mirror to the encroaching darkness, but there was something else in it. Something hidden beneath the surface. I could feel it. The weight of the place. The presence that had been watching me, waiting for me. I walked slowly toward the water, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet the only sound in the stillness. My breath was shallow, each step more hesitant than the last. I knew I was risking everything by being here, but I couldn't stop myself. When I reached the water's edge, I knelt, my eyes scanning the surface. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Too normal. The water was still, the reflection of the trees on its surface unbroken, like glass. I could almost imagine that nothing had happened. That the body hadn't been there, that the man hadn't risen from the depths. But I knew better now. I knew the truth. The wind picked up again, sending a shiver through me. The sound of it brushing through the trees was the only thing that broke the silence. I hesitated for a moment, then reached into my pocket. The key. I had kept it with me, even though I had no idea what it meant. What it unlocked. I pulled it out and held it in my hand, the cold metal pressing against my palm. It felt heavier now, as if it had gained some kind of significance in the short time I'd had it. The water seemed to pulse beneath my fingertips. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was waiting for me beneath the surface. Something that had been there all along. I stood up, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do with this key? What was I supposed to find? The scrape of footsteps broke through my thoughts, and I whipped around, my heart pounding. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving in the trees, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I turned back to the water. The surface was shifting now, the ripples spreading outward in slow, deliberate waves. The shadows beneath the water seemed to shift, to gather, and I knew deep down that something was emerging. The water parted. I watched breathless as a hand reached out from the depths. It wasn't the man I had seen before. This was different. This hand was long, pale, and grotesque, the fingers twisted and contorted as if they didn't belong to any living thing. It rose slowly, emerging from the water like something from a nightmare, its movement unnaturally smooth. I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. My throat was dry, my body rooted to the spot. The hand continued to rise, and soon the figure that followed it emerged fully from the water. It was the man, but not the same man. His face was still pale, but it was distorted now, twisted into something unrecognizable. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with an unnatural hunger. His body was emaciated, as if the water had drained all the life from it, leaving only a hollow shell. But it wasn't just him. Behind him the water churned, and from the depths more figures began to emerge. Twisted, deformed shapes, crawling and dragging themselves from the reservoir's depths. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My mind screamed for me to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the horror unfolding before me. The figures began to rise from the water, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were following some unseen command. Their eyes were fixed on me, hollow and empty, and I could feel the weight of their gaze, like they were trying to pull something from deep within me. And then in the midst of the nightmare, the man No, the thing that had once been a man, spoke, its voice rasping, barely more than a whisper. "You shouldn't have come back." The words were a death sentence. And I knew in that moment that I had made a terrible mistake. I turned to run, but the ground beneath me seemed to shift, the earth trembling as the water rose around me. The figures moved faster now, their twisted bodies crawling toward me, dragging themselves closer, closer. And then in the distance I heard it again, the scrape of something moving, something coming for me. It was too late. There was no escape. It's strange how life shifts in an instant. How one moment you're watching the sky and the next, everything is consumed by chaos. I still remember that sound, the deafening roar of the engines cutting through the air, followed by the sickening screech of metal twisting, tearing apart. The crash. I was standing on the observation deck, watching the planes take off like I did every day. I work in aviation, nothing fancy, just the kind of job that keeps you grounded, literally. But that day, something was different. It wasn't the usual noise or the familiar sight of the planes as they ascended into the clear blue sky. No, that day it was something else. A sound louder than anything I had ever heard before. And then a sudden tremor beneath my feet, followed by the gut-wrenching screech that sent every muscle in my body rigid. I looked up just in time to see the plane descending, a streak of black cutting through the bright daylight like a knife through butter. There was no time to react, no time to think. The crash happened in slow motion, like a nightmare I couldn't escape. The fireball, the smoke, the screams, they all blurred together in a cacophony of chaos. But the worst part, the silence that followed. The sirens wailed as the emergency responders flooded the scene, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from the wreckage. I don't know why. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was something deeper. But I stood there, watching as they pulled the bodies from the wreckage, the horror of it all sinking into the pit of my stomach. I should have left. I should have walked away from the sight like everyone else. But instead I stayed. I stayed and watched as the dust settled, and the world began to feel a little less real. And that's when it happened. It was hours later, after the fire had been put out and the rescue teams had left. The sky, which had been so chaotic before, was now eerily still. The noise of the crash had dissipated, replaced by the hum of the city in the distance. I was walking back to my car, my mind still numb, when I heard it. A plane. I looked up instinctively, expecting to see the usual commercial flights, but what I saw made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't one of the usual planes. It was wrong. The shape, the silhouette. It was too dark, too out of place. A jet that shouldn't have been there, a black shadow against the brightening sky. I stood frozen, staring up at it. The hum of its engines was low and guttural, like a growl, not the smooth hum of a modern aircraft. It wasn't a commercial plane, and yet it looked like one. A thick contrail trailed behind it, but the strange thing was, the trail didn't dissipate. It lingered, hanging in the sky like a black ribbon, stretching across the horizon. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a military craft. But no, there was something off about it. Something that felt wrong. I quickly looked around, but there was no one else. The streets were empty. The crash site was still, the emergency teams long gone. The only sounds were the distant hum of the city and the faint buzz of the airplane's engines. I should have left. I should have gotten into my car and driven away. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the sky. The plane flew higher, climbing into the clouds, and I felt a strange compulsion to follow it. Something about that plane didn't belong. Something about it felt like it was connected to the crash, to the wreckage. But that didn't make sense, did it? I didn't know anything about aviation that would explain what I had just witnessed. I wasn't a pilot. I didn't have the training to recognize every kind of aircraft. And yet, I felt like I had just seen something I wasn't supposed to see. A chill ran down my spine, and for the first time that day, I wasn't just afraid of the wreckage. I was afraid of the sky. I couldn't explain what happened next. I walked to my car, still shaken, but as I got in, I noticed something strange. The city lights in the distance seemed to flicker. The streets, normally bustling with activity, were silent. It was as though the world had become muted, every sound absorbed by the air around me. Even the hum of the city seemed distant, like it had been shut off completely. I shook my head. I was overthinking it. But that feeling, the nagging, gnawing feeling that something wasn't right, stuck with me. It clung to me as I started the engine, as I drove away from the crash site. And then, just as I was about to turn onto the main road, the radio flickered to life. A distorted voice crackled through the speakers, investigating unusual flight patterns in the area, missing aircraft. Authorities have no information on the origin. I slammed my hand against the radio, but the static didn't stop. The voice, faint, almost ghostly, continued. Keep clear of the area, stay alert, the skies may not be safe. The words hung in the air as the radio went silent, the screen blinking off. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't focus. My heart was pounding again, faster than ever before. What was going on? What had I just heard? I wanted to turn the car around. I wanted to go back and check the sky. I wanted to know if the plane was still up there. But the rational part of me told me to drive. To leave it behind. The crash, the voice, the strange airplane. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it wouldn't go away. It followed me like a shadow. The night stretched on, the city passing by in a blur. But somewhere above me, that plane was still there. I could feel it. I could hear its engines. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse than a crash, was waiting for me in the skies. I tried to shake it off. I told myself that I was imagining things, that the crash and the strange radio transmission had left me rattled. It had been a long, tense day, and I hadn't had a moment to breathe since the accident. Of course, my mind was running wild. But as the streets blurred past me, something inside me refused to let go of the nagging feeling that something was very, very wrong. I parked my car in the small, quiet lot near my apartment. The night air felt unusually cool, a chill that sunk deep into my skin as I stepped out. The usual city sounds were quieter than they should have been. I felt that same eerie silence, the hum of the world muted, as if it were holding its breath. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I glanced up at the sky, half expecting to see that dark shape again, but the heavens were clear, empty. I should have been relieved, but instead the absence felt wrong. Like the sky had erased the very thing that had terrified me earlier. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, like a quiet, looming presence. Inside, the apartment was still. Too still. The lights flickered as I entered, and I paused, a shiver crawling up my spine. The apartment had never felt this cold before. It wasn't just the temperature, something in the air had changed. I couldn't place it, but I knew deep down it wasn't just a draft. It felt like a warning. I tried to push the thoughts aside. I had to focus. I needed to call my boss and report in, tell him about the crash. But as I reached for the phone, it rang before I could dial. I stared at the screen. No name, just an unknown number. My heart skipped. I almost didn't want to answer, but I did. Hello. The voice on the other end was distorted, crackling through static. It was hard to make out at first, but there was no mistaking the urgency in the tone. You saw it, didn't you? The voice rasped. My breath caught. The voice, it was the same one from the radio earlier, the one I thought had been a glitch. But now it was clear, and chillingly familiar. Who is this? I demanded, my fingers tightening around the receiver. The voice paused, and when it spoke again, it was softer, almost conspiratorial. You saw the plane, didn't you? The one that wasn't supposed to be there. It's still up there, and it's not alone. I was silent for a moment. The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on me. Who are you? I finally asked, my voice trembling despite myself. What do you mean it's not alone? The line went dead. I stood frozen for a moment, the receiver still pressed to my ear. A cold sweat had broken out across my forehead. What the hell was happening? I set the phone down slowly, my mind spinning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something I couldn't control, something far larger than a simple accident. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, a part of me already dreading the answers I might find. The streets felt different now. More oppressive. The sky above was darker than before, and I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched. My instincts were screaming at me to turn back, to forget all of this. But something kept pushing me forward. I found myself at the local airport, the place where the crash had occurred just hours earlier. The tarmac was quiet now, the noise of the emergency vehicles and crowds replaced by an unnatural stillness. The wreckage had been cleared, but the air still felt thick with the remnants of the tragedy. I couldn't stop myself. I had to see it again. I needed to understand what had happened. I walked along the perimeter, keeping my distance from the still active area where investigators had gathered. But there was something else out here. Something beyond the wreckage. I felt the familiar hum in the air, the same tension I had felt earlier, pressing against my skin. As I walked, my foot caught something on the ground. I looked down, startled, and found a small, charred piece of metal. I knelt, picking it up carefully. The metal was jagged, burned, and misshapen, but there was something about it that didn't match the wreckage of the plane I had seen earlier. This piece wasn't from the crash. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the heat radiating from it, and as I did, I heard something. A faint sound at first, but it was growing louder. The unmistakable whine of engines, a low hum that vibrated in the air, just like the plane I had seen earlier. I spun around, my heart racing, my hands suddenly clammy. The sound was coming from above, and this time I knew it wasn't a trick of my mind. I looked up. There it was, the plane, but it wasn't like the commercial flights that passed overhead. It was too dark, too ominous. The contrail behind it wasn't dissipating. It lingered in the air, thick and unnatural, a black stain on the sky. And it was heading straight for me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I stood frozen, watching it approach. The plane wasn't making a sound now, not the deafening roar of engines that filled the air, just the slow, deliberate descent. My heart pounded in my chest as I took an involuntary step back. The plane didn't seem right. It didn't feel like a plane at all. It was as if something else was behind it, controlling it, guiding it. I watched entranced as it drew closer. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Just disappeared into thin air. I stood there, unable to breathe, my mind reeling. What had just happened? What was I witnessing? I didn't know if the plane had really been there, or if it was some kind of hallucination. But I knew one thing, whatever it wasn't done with me. I stood in the empty parking lot, staring up at the sky, my mind struggling to catch up with what I had just witnessed. The plane, the sudden disappearance, the deep, suffocating silence that followed, it was all too much to process. My pulse was still racing, my hands shaking as I clutched the piece of metal in my palm. The edges were jagged, charred, and yet there was something familiar about it, something that made my stomach twist. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. This couldn't just be coincidence. The plane, the disappearance, the strange transmission on the radio, it all had to be connected somehow. But how? And why? I turned and walked back toward my car, the crunch of my footsteps the only sound in the still night. The wind had picked up again, but it felt colder now, sharper, as if the air itself was warning me to stay away from the truth. I got in the car and slammed the door shut, my heart still pounding in my chest. I had to figure this out. I had to understand what was going on before it was too late. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, the car's headlights cutting through the dark streets. My mind was spinning. I didn't know who to trust. The voice on the phone. The authority. They were all too quiet, too unsure. No one was giving me any answers. And then, just as I was about to make a turn, the radio flickered back to life. The distorted voice was back, the same crackling, static-filled transmission. If you're listening to this, you're too close. You've seen it, haven't you? The plane. It's not just an accident. It's not just a crash. It's something else. Something ancient. Keep away. Don't look for answers. It will find you. The voice was distorted, barely audible over the static, but the message was clear. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. The warning was almost too much to ignore. But I couldn't stop now. I needed to know what was happening. What had happened? I drove in a daze, my mind fixated on the words of the mysterious voice. Keep away. Something ancient. The plane had appeared out of nowhere, and now, just like that, it was gone. But it wasn't over. I made my way to the local aviation office, my stomach twisted in knots. I needed to talk to someone who could explain all of this. But as I parked and approached the entrance, I saw something that made my heart freeze. There at the door was a man in a dark jacket, standing completely still. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me as I approached. Something about him felt wrong, too still, too quiet, like he wasn't supposed to be there. I hesitated for a moment, but I had already come this far. I pushed open the door, stepping into the cool, dimly lit office. The man didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. His presence alone sent a chill down my spine. I walked to the front desk, my gaze flicking nervously between the man and the office staff, who were all too busy to notice my discomfort. One of them glanced up at me. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her voice normal, but her eyes were too bright, almost too eager. She didn't look like she'd just been sitting at her desk. I stopped, my words choking in my throat. I didn't know where to start. The crash, the plane, the warning. There were too many questions. But I needed answers. I need information about the crash. The one that happened earlier today. And about the aircraft that appeared after it. I tried to sound confident, but my voice wavered despite myself. The receptionist nodded slowly, her smile widening. "I'm afraid we can't provide details about the incident. It's classified right now, pending investigation." She seemed too calm for the circumstances. "But I can help with flight schedules if you need that." I frowned. "No, I need information on the flight pattern. The plane that vanished." She paused for a moment, and her expression shifted. Something flickered in her eyes, something that I couldn't quite read. But before she could respond, the man at the door shifted, his gaze never leaving me. "Leave it," he said, his voice low but sharp, like a command. It was the same man from outside, and his presence was suffocating. I turned to face him, my pulse quickening. "What do you know about the plane?" I demanded, my voice shaking with frustration. He didn't move, but his eyes seemed to penetrate me, as if searching for something. It's already too late. They're watching. You shouldn't have come here. The receptionist remained silent, staring at us both with an odd, knowing look. The air felt thick, as if something was shifting beneath it, something ancient, something I couldn't understand. The man turned abruptly, walking out of the office without another word. His footsteps echoed in the otherwise silent room, and I watched him disappear out the door, the strange tension hanging in the air long after he was gone. I stood there unsure of what to do next. My mind was reeling. What was he talking about? Who was watching? What had I gotten myself into? I needed answers, but something told me I wasn't going to find them here. I left the office, my legs heavy, my mind full of questions and unanswered fears. As I stepped outside into the cold night, I looked up at the sky once more. The clouds had parted, and for the first time I noticed something strange. A faint glowing contrail. It wasn't from a plane. It wasn't natural. It was like a warning, and it was heading straight toward me. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The sky had changed, and so had I. I stood frozen, my gaze fixed on the glowing contrail that stretched across the sky. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. It was too bright, almost unnatural, and yet it didn't dissipate like normal contrails. No, this one lingered, shimmering faintly, almost as if it were alive, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make my move. I looked around, hoping that someone else would see it, that I wasn't the only one who could feel the weight of it. But the streets were empty, the air still, and the only sounds that reached me were the distant hum of traffic and the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. There was no one to confirm what I was seeing, and that made the entire experience feel even more unsettling. I hurried back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. The world felt too quiet now, as though the plane, or whatever it was, had shifted everything. The sky, the city, the world itself, nothing felt right. I gripped the steering wheel as I drove, my mind racing. Where was the plane? What had happened to it? Had it simply disappeared into thin air like the last one? As I navigated the streets, I tried to push the fear away. I had to be rational, I told myself. The planes didn't just vanish. There had to be an explanation. A glitch in the radar. Some sort of malfunction. Maybe it wasn't even a plane at all. But as I turned onto my street and parked, the feeling that something was terribly wrong settled over me like a heavy blanket. I stepped out of the car, but before I could reach my front door, I heard it. A low hum. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same sound, the same deep, throbbing hum from before. But this time it was closer. Much closer. I turned, my eyes searching the sky, my heart racing with the sense that something was circling above me, just out of sight. It felt like the air itself had thickened, as though the sky was pressing down on me, closing in. I couldn't see anything, but the sound, steady, low, like a vibration in my bones, made it impossible to ignore. Then it happened again. The ground trembled faintly at first, like the reverberations of an explosion far in the distance. But the noise, it grew louder, closer. My eyes shot up, my breath coming in short gasps as the humming intensified, vibrating through the air. It was as if the plane, or whatever it was flying directly above me, but I still couldn't see it. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me, my hands trembling as I locked it. The air in the apartment felt different now. Heavier, like it was charged with something I couldn't explain. I turned on the lights, needing the comfort of their warmth, their familiarity. But even as the bulbs flickered to life, the sense of unease only deepened. There was a knock at the door. I froze, my blood running cold. Who could be here at this hour? My mind raced, running through every possible explanation, none of them comforting. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just someone lost, someone with a question. But the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I approached the door cautiously, my hand on the handle. I glanced through the peephole, but there was no one there. No movement, no sign of anyone outside. I hesitated. The knock had sounded so real, so urgent, but I wasn't about to open that door without knowing who was on the other side. Instead, I turned away from it and made my way to the window. I peered out into the darkness, scanning the street for any sign of movement. But the street was empty, silent. Nothing but the soft glow of the streetlights casting long shadows along the pavement. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It had to be my imagination. The stress, the crash, the strange events, they were all starting to get to me. I was losing my grip. I had to calm down. But as I turned to walk away from the window, I noticed something. A shadow. It was subtle at first, barely visible, but there. Moving across the yard, creeping just along the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe an animal. But the longer I stared, the more distinct it became. Someone was there. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel the weight of the gaze on me. It was like a presence, like it was studying me, watching my every move. I stepped back from the window, heart pounding in my chest. My thoughts were racing. Who was out there? Was it the person who had knocked? Or was it something else? Something worse. The shadow moved again, this time closer to the house. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't just stand in the dark, waiting for something to happen. I needed to do something. I needed to leave. I grabbed my jacket and reached for my keys, but just as I was about to turn the handle of the door, the lights flickered. Once, twice, the room grew colder. My breath came out in a visible puff, despite the warmth of the apartment. Then the knock came again. Louder, more frantic, and I knew then with a certainty that cut through the terror that whatever was outside wasn't human. It was something else. Something that had been waiting for me. I couldn't stay. I couldn't escape. But I had no choice but to face whatever was waiting in the shadows. And I was running out of time. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my heartbeat a drum in my ears, as the knock on the door echoed through the silence of the apartment. I stood there for a long moment, paralyzed by the thought of what was outside. Whoever or whatever was on the other side of that door, I couldn't face it. Not now. Not after everything that had already happened. The knock came again, louder this time, a sharp, insistent thud that sent a tremor through my body. There was no denying it anymore. Someone or something was out there, and I was the one it was coming for. I stepped back from the door, heart hammering, trying to think of what to do next. I had no weapons. I had no way of defending myself. There was nowhere to run. My mind raced as I scanned the room, desperate for some kind of escape. The shadow outside the window had moved closer, and the cold that filled the air felt like it was seeping into my bones. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. But I had no idea what I was running from or what I was running toward. The knock came again, followed by a voice that chilled me to the core. Let me in. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and it was one I couldn't ignore. The voice was distorted, unfamiliar, but the authority in it made my blood run cold. My hands trembled as I backed away from the door, my mind trying to process what was happening. Who was this? What did they want from me? I looked around the apartment, at the familiar walls and furniture that now felt foreign, threatening. It wasn't just the knock that had made everything shift, it was the presence outside, the feeling that something was closing in on me. My instincts screamed that I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my phone and dialed the only number I could think of, an old friend, someone who might be able to help. The line rang, then clicked, but there was no answer. I tried again and again, but all I heard was the endless buzzing, like the universe itself was holding its breath. I slammed the phone down in frustration, feeling a rising panic threaten to overtake me. The knock came once more. This time I couldn't ignore it. My feet moved before my mind could catch up, and I found myself walking toward the door, drawn by something I couldn't explain. I reached for the handle, my fingers cold against the metal, and stopped just before opening it. My heart was pounding in my throat, the urge to turn and run overwhelming. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I couldn't open the door. I couldn't give in to whatever was waiting outside. But that feeling, the feeling that I had no choice, that something was pulling me toward it, was stronger than any sense of logic. I turned the handle. The door creaked open, and I was greeted by nothing but the empty hallway. The apartment was silent. The lights flickered again, casting long shadows along the walls. My breath was shallow, my mind on edge, as I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. The hallway was empty. No one was there. No one at all. I stepped back, unsure whether I had imagined the knocks, the voice, or if I had lost my mind altogether. But something told me to keep moving. Something told me that the answers I was searching for weren't inside the apartment. They were somewhere out there, beyond the walls, in the spaces that I couldn't understand. I walked to the elevator, my pulse still racing, and pressed the button to go down. As the elevator door closed behind me, I heard something. A faint hum. It was low at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with every passing second, filling the empty space around me. The sound was familiar, the same low, rhythmic hum I had heard earlier when the plane appeared. I looked up, but the elevator's metal walls reflected only my own nervous face, pale and drawn. I was alone, but I was. The elevator dropped with a lurch, as if it had been pulled downward too quickly. I grabbed onto the railing inside, my stomach lurching, my body pressed against the floor as the speed increased. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the only thought I could grasp was the relentless hum in the background growing louder, suffocating everything else. The doors opened suddenly, and I stumbled out into the lobby. The hum stopped as quickly as it had started, leaving a ringing in my ears. The lobby was dark, the lights flickering like a malfunctioning bulb. I could see the shape of the door leading outside, and a part of me wanted to run through it, to leave everything behind. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I walked to the window, pushing the curtain aside. The street outside was bathed in dim light, the usual traffic absent. And then I saw it. The sky. It was no longer just an ordinary night sky. The blackness had deepened, and in the distance I could see the shape of the same plane. It hovered suspended in the air, not moving, just there, impossibly still. I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat. The same dark shape, the same contrail, but this time it was different. The plane wasn't just above me. It was right there, hanging in the sky like it was waiting for something or someone. I felt the pull again. The feeling that I was being watched, that I was being drawn towards something that I didn't understand. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing, my hands trembling. Something was coming. Something that was tied to the plane, to everything that had happened. And I didn't know how much longer I could fight it. But I knew one thing for certain. I had to find the truth. I had to face whatever was above me in the sky, whatever was watching me from the darkened clouds. I couldn't run from it anymore. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.